All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 class, which is Web Development Technologies, I'm creating a series of video presentations based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I have gone through the getting started with the web and the HTML, and I'm into the second module under CSS, which is CSS building blocks. We had the overview, and now we're jumping into cascade and inheritance. Notice it says here that the aim of this lesson is to develop your understanding of some of the more fundamental concepts of CSS: cascade, specificity, and inheritance. It says, while working through this lesson may seem less immediately relevant and a little more academic, it's something that we're going to be looking at, using, etc. later on. All right. Again, the cascading part of cascading style sheets, as the author mentions here, is incredibly important to understand. At some point, you'll be working on a project and you'll find that the CSS you thought would be applied in one way is not working that way. All right. Usually, as it says right here, the problem is that you've got two different rules that could be applied to the same element. All right. The cascade, as it says, and the closely related concept of specificity are mechanisms that control which rule is applied when. All right. Also significant here again is inheritance, which means that some properties by default inherit values from their parent and some don't, which can cause unexpected behavior at best. So the author says here, let's start by taking a quick look at what we're talking about, okay? Then, as mentioned, we'll go in and see how each of these things that are in here interact with one another, okay? All right. Style sheets cascade. As it says, at a very simple level, what this means is the order of the rules matters. When two rules have equal specificity, the one that comes last wins. And the example that's given here is really simplistic. Why you would ever do this, I'm not real sure, but you are trying to apply two different rules to the H1 element. First, you're saying that you want the color or the text color to be red. Then you're saying you want it to be blue. Well, it ends up being blue because these two have the same, basically, they're identical selectors, so they have the same specificity. So last in wins, so to speak. And again, specificity, as they mention here, is how the browser decides which rule will apply if you've got multiple rules. All right, it says it's basically a measure of how specific a selector's selection will be. So look at these. An element selector is less specific, where a class selector is more specific. What does that mean? It means that an element is more general. It selects all elements of that type that appear on a page, whereas a class selector is more specific. So it typically you won't have a class in there that you apply to everything. All right. So they're going to give an example right here. It says example time. Below we again have two rules that could apply to an H1. All right, it says the below H1 ends up being colored red right here. And why does it end up becoming colored red? Because again, class selectors are more specific than element selectors. So let's double check and make sure indeed this is the case. So I'm going to come in and grab this. In fact, both of them, I guess. we had this download file in here, and I think what I'll do is I'll keep using this, but I'm going to comment out all of the CSS that's in there currently. And we will also comment out all of the HTML that's currently in here. All right, and we'll come in here and we'll just put in this. Whoops, and that was our CSS. So we'll put that up here. That's fine. And what does it say? It says that we have a class, whoops, and that class is called main heading. All right, and that class will have a color red associated with it. We also will have, we're saying we want all H1 tags to have a blue font color. All right, so jumping back into here, again, this should be pretty self-evident. That said, I mean, we're still looking at this. We're still, you know, for lack of better words, getting into this stuff. So, but let's look at what we've got. So class equal main heading, which means it's going to apply this, but it is an H1, so it's going to also try to apply this. Well, again, we've already mentioned this, but I'm saying it again. This is more specific because it's a class than this is what's for an element. So it should appear, I believe at least, in red. And there it is. This is my heading. Now we still got this underline here. Let's see why we've got that. Not sure, to be honest with you. And I'm not going to worry about it. So this is my heading. Right there. And it's red. Okay. All right, let's continue on then. It says we will explain specificity scoring and other such concepts later on. All right. Inheritance. Now, one thing to realize is with computer inheritance, it's all like genetic inheritance, but it's not identical to genetic inheritance. In other words, in genetic inheritance, typically if you have a man and a woman and they both have a big nose and they have a child together, typically that child will have a big nose. Now, of course, not always, but usually that's the way that it happens. All right. Well, it's not necessarily always going to be like that for computer inheritance, as you'll see. So it says inheritance also needs to be understood in this context. Let's check our time here. We're at 9 minutes, so I'm fine. Some CSS properties set on parent elements are inherited by their children and some are not. For example, it says if you set a color in the font family on an element, every element inside of it will also have that color and font unless you apply a different color and font to them. So if we look here, it says as the body has been set to have a color of blue, everything with it is going to have a color of blue, except in this case, we're saying that spans should have a color of black. So this is what we have right here. So notice that everything up to here, everything from here up till right here is just part of the body, so it'll naturally be blue. This word span right here is inside of a span tag. What's kind of interesting, you may or may not have noticed, is the period is outside. So whereas the word span is in blue, the period, when you go back to it, the span is in black, but the period is in blue. Some properties do not inherit. For example, it says if you set a width of 50% of an element, all of its descendants do not get a width of 50% for their parent's width. Okay? If this was the case, it would make CSS much more frustrating to use. All right, so time to start hopefully understanding, as it says, how these concepts work together. It says these three concepts, those of cascade, specificity, and inheritance, together control which CSS applies to what element. In the sections below, we'll see how they work together. As it says, it can sometimes get a bit complicated. I don't even know if it's so much complicated as, at times at least, it can almost become a little bit confusing. All right. But it says you will start to remember them as you get more experience with CSS, and you can always look up the details. That's one of the keys, again, is being able to look up what you need. All right, this video shows how you can use the Firefox dev tools. There are also dev tools. It's the inspector, basically, inside of Chrome. And there's even one in Microsoft Edge. All right. Understanding inheritance. It says we'll start with inheritance. In the example below, we have an unordered list. That's the item 1, the item 2, the item 3, etc. with two levels of unordered lists nested inside of it. We also have an outer, we have given the outer border, padding, and font color. The color has been applied to the direct children, but also the indirect children, the immediate child, LIs, and those inside the first nested list. What does that mean? That means everything on the outside, item 1, item 2, and item 3, and the first two children, these two, are all meant to be the bluish color. Then we've added another class called special to this one, and as you can see, it's black. This then inherits down through its children. So this is what they're showing in here. So let's grab this, copy it to the clipboard, put it in here. All right, and then we'll remove all of this. And we'll bring in this right here. Now, if this works, this should end up looking, when we get done, like this. All right. Let's check and see if it does. All right. Now everything looks okay, except we still have the boxes around here. I'm not sure why, but we do. Like I said, I wish I could see what I'm missing here. I'm going to take everything that was in here. I thought it was all commented out, but just in case, I'm going to remove all of it. Well, that border here is where that's coming from. So I don't think this is going to look any different. Oh, it did. Okay. So this looks exactly like it does in the book. All right, or on here. Things like widths, margin, and padding borders do not inherit. If a border were to be inherited by the children, every single list and every single list item would gain a border. And that's, as they say, it probably wouldn't be what you'd want. All right, that would actually end up looking pretty bad. Which properties are inherited by default and which are not, as it says, largely comes down to common sense. CSS provides 4 special universal property values. Inherit, as you can see, it sets the property value applied to a selected element to be the same as its parent. As mentioned, in fact, it turns on inheritance. Initial sets the property value to a selected element to an initial value of that property. And unset, which resets it to its default or natural value. There's also a newer one, as it says, revert, but it has limited browser support. All right. Let's see if we can get through this part right here, and then we'll stop before we go on to the resetting all property values. We can look at a list of links and explore how universal values work. The live example below allows you to play with CSS and sees what happens when you make changes. All right. So, as mentioned, the second list item has a class of myClass1. Sets the color nested inside to inherit. All right. So, in other words, this one, it's got a myClass1, a myClass2, and myClass3. So that's got a myClass1, which should inherit, which means it should grab everything from here, which is why it's all green. The next one has a myClass2, as it says, the color of the initial. So what was it set to initially? And the last one does an unset, which basically just goes back and resets it. A little bit confusing here. All right, let's just take a look at what this says. The second list item has a class of myClass1 that sets the color of the A element inside to inherit. It says if you remove the rule, how does it change the color of the link? Well, if you remove the rule, I would believe with no rule, it would come back and do the default. Number 2, do you understand why the third and fourth links have the color they have? Check the descriptions above if not. All right, and finally, which of the links will change color if you define a new one? For example, A, color red. All right. Let's stop right here, and then we'll come back and we'll try to answer these questions in the next part of the lecture.